I gotta be honest with you guys. I have no idea about this movie being released. I don't know how it happened, but it happened. This movie just kind of slipped past me, even though this movie was one of Netflix's most watched movies at the time. And I just don't know. I have no idea how. And I only knew of this movie quite recently. And I don't know how it happened, but it kind of slipped past me and I had no idea of this movie's existence. But I eventually got around to it and I watched the 2021 film Army of Thieves. This movie is a prequel to the 2021 released Army of the Dead and is also the second installment in the Army of the Dead franchise. I had very low expectations prior to watching this movie because I wasn't all that pleased with the first installment, and while there was entertaining parts to it, there were several parts where it just kind of, at the end of the day, it was just a forgettable, average movie, that one. And I had similar expectations for this film. I don't even know why this film was necessary, because never once while I was watching the first installment did I feel like any of these characters should get a spin-off movie. That thought never crossed my mind, and yet here we are with Ludwig Dieter getting a spin-off movie. The Safecracker from the first installment has its own spin-off movie, and this movie is also directed by him, Matthias Schweighöfer. I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name. And he's also one of the producers of this movie. So this is most likely a personal project for him, taking the characters from Zack Snyder's Army of the Dead and crafting a solo movie based on his character leading up to, his recruitment. While I did have lower expectations, this movie actually surprised me quite a bit, and in most aspects. This movie shot so much better than the first movie. Here, while there are traces of the first movie where some shots are slightly out of focus, in this movie it's utilized a lot less. And by that, you can see some of the shots more clearly. It's much better shot. You can actually see things, even if some of the things are blurred, you can still see some of the background. It's not as overly blurred, or, it doesn't have that shallow depth of field as much, or it wasn't distracting enough that I noticed a lot of it. And some of those shots are done really well. It's much better directed than the first installment, and I like the character interactions much better here. There are a lot of bonding moments, which I felt like is the highlight of this movie, and that is what actually surprised me, because the first film lacked any of that. It just went straight to the insane, crazy stuff, whereas here you get to see Ludwig bond with some of them, or at least he tries to bond with some of them. It's quite it was one of the more entertaining parts, and I also liked the heist aspects of the movie. The way he cracks the safe, his, how he cracks the safe, his methods. This movie was a lot funnier than the first one, than the first installment, and I kind of like that. I also liked his interaction with the female lead, Nathalie Emmanuel, as Gwendolyn Starr. I liked his interaction with her, and yeah. So basically the character interactions are much better here, and some of the dialogues I also did not mind. There are comedic angle in this movie, again, much better. And I also liked some of the graphics that is used in this movie. And when you look at the character introductions, the graphics used there will remind you of the 2016 movie Suicide Squad in how they introduce his characters, but I feel like it fits much better here. And I kind of like the graphics too, like how they display like where they are, like the location headers kind of blends in with the background. I especially love the graphics that is used, especially when when he's cracking the safe. You go inside the safe, and then there's a whole graphic with the gears turning, and then the things like the mechanics of the safe. I really enjoyed all of that. And I also liked the performances of three people in particular, three people from the actual heist team. And that is, one is of course Matthias Schweighöfer, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing any of these names. It's a bit difficult for me, but I hope I'm close. So I like the performances of Matthias Schweighöfer and Nathalie Emmanuel and Ruby Ophie. I felt like of the three, she was the more interesting character. I feel like I wanted to see more of her interacting with the team. And I also liked how she interacts with them. I kind of like the dialogues that are given to her and how she delivers those dialogues. I feel like her and Matthias are the two comedic golds in this film. And that's pretty much where all the positives lie. Now, if you watched the first Army of the Dead, there's like Ludwig makes a point that he has never seen zombies before. And that is the major issue with this film. And that is that this movie has a very minute, like it's a very thin line, and the connection to the Army of the Dead franchise is so paper thin that you feel like it wasn't even needed in a film like this. Like, you don't even see any zombies because you can't. That's like, you have to work around it, and that's one of the biggest drawbacks, is that this is not as connected as it should have been, considering that Ludwig has never met or interacted with a zombie prior to the first installment. So the first installment is where he's dealing with the zombies, head on. So this movie has to work around that. Anytime he's seen fighting a zombie, it all happens in a dream. And the only real connection to the Army of the Dead is one or two mentions of the thing that's happening in Nevada, the zombie pandemic or epidemic or whatever it is, and some news forecasts on his TV. That's the extent of it. And aside from that, there isn't really much of a strong connection to the first movie. So that's one of the biggest problems that I have with this. And also that the story, it's just every heist movie you have ever seen, and the story isn't really anything that's fresh. It's just turn your brain off and enjoy kind of a film, which I did. I like the execution of it. It's just that story-wise, there isn't really anything that, the substance is not there. It's just a thrill ride. And my only other negative would be that the villains, or I guess the villains, basically the cops, the Interpol that's trying to capture the team, it was just, it felt more like an addition more than a necessity. I felt like what are they even doing? Why? Even if they weren't in the movie, I felt like things would have played out exactly the same with minor differences. Like, I much would have preferred rather be like, an Ocean's 11 kind of a thing, or one of the Ocean's films, which is just a straight up heist. That I would have much preferred that. But yeah, you kind of needed something for Ludwig to be alone for the Army of the Dead Army of the Dead movie. So I felt like that's what I meant by they felt more like additions more than a necessity. And those are pretty much it. Those are my only problems with the movie that I can think of. I enjoyed the movie fine. It had some good performances, especially from them, and even one of the, I guess, antagonist. He's not really an antagonist up until like the second half, or much later in the second half. Stuart Martin as Brad Cage, or Alexis, which is his real name. I like the reference to Nicolas Cage. There were some things in the movie where I was just thinking it and it just happened. Like, the moment he's introduced as Brad Cage, and that immediately went tuned my brain to Nicolas Cage, and then the very next shot is him getting inspired by Nicolas Cage. Like, his inspiration for bodybuilding is Nicolas Cage. I like that. Yeah, and Guz Khan as Rolf. These two, I felt like meh. Like, they become villains at the last moment. Rolf, not so much. Like, Guz Khan, not so much. But, Brad Cage, Stuart Martin, especially. And I felt like he was just a meh kind of a thing. Again, something which felt more like an addition more than a necessity. Like, he didn't really need to become the villain. But, you know, he's someone for Matthias to have a rivalry with. Sure, why not? But if I have to look at the movie overall, I say it's a very enjoyable film. I enjoyed this more than Army of the Dead. In certain aspects, it's executed better than Army of the Dead. And I feel like if you have to choose between the two films, I would highly recommend you watch this film instead of the first installment. You're not going to miss much since it's a prequel. Even though this had less to do with the zombie apocalypse, I enjoyed the heist aspects more, but despite all the negatives, it is an enjoyable film. Like, it has some rewatch value. The problem persists. Like, I don't think a day from now there isn't going to be anything that's memorable about this movie, and that's kind of the problem I had with the first one, where it wasn't a super memorable film. I barely remember much of the details the first installment, and I feel like it's the same thing here, but I feel like I'm going to remember more scenes from this film than the first one. The only thing I remember from the first one was the Queen zombie and the Tiger zombie. That's pretty much it. This is a movie that if you haven't watched it yet, or if you missed it somehow, like what happened with me, then I feel like you should definitely give this a watch, especially since the third installment is scheduled to release sometime this year. So I feel like it's a good way to catch up on the Army of the Dead franchise. I would recommend you watch this one first and then Army of the Dead, even though the release date is like 5 months apart and is done in reverse. But, you know, I highly recommend it. It's very enjoyable, and if you want to watch something casual for 2 hours, then yeah, this is a very good choice. And so if it's a casual viewing that you're looking for, then I highly recommend this movie.
Girl, you shut me down and there's no witness. Got me in my feels, she would never listen. All the alcohol is in my liver. I guess I lost and you're the winner. Missing your touch, you were a good kiss.